In 1969, Richard Nixon was elected as President of the United States. At this time, the people of the United States were extremely unhappy and were protesting the involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. This led to Nixon's main priority being how to end the United States' involvement in the war. He came up with the idea of Vietnamization. On November 3, 1969, Richard Nixon addressed this idea of Vietnamization.
My fellow Americans, I am sure you can recognize from what I have said that we really only have two choices open to us if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate, precipitate withdrawal of all Americans from Vietnam without regard to the effects of that action. Or we can persist in our search for a just peace through a negotiated settlement if possible, or through continued implementation of our plan for Vietnamization if necessary. A plan in which we will withdraw all of our forces from Vietnam on a schedule in accordance with our program as the South Vietnamese become strong enough to defend their own freedom. I have chosen this second course. It is not the easy way. It is the right way. I recognize that some of my fellow citizens disagree with the plan for peace I've chosen. Honest and patriotic Americans have reached different conclusions as to how peace should be achieved. In San Francisco, a few weeks ago, I saw demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Lose in Vietnam, bring the boys home." Well, one of the strengths of our free society is that any American has a right to reach that conclusion and to advocate that point of view. But as President of the United States, I would be untrue to my oath of office if I allowed the policy of this nation to be dictated by the minority who hold that point of view and who try to impose it on the nation by mounting demonstrations in the street. And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support.
In 1969, there were up to 540,000 military personnel in South Vietnam. On April 20th of 1970, President Nixon announced the withdrawal of an additional 150,000 American military personnel over the course of the next several months. By the end of the year, the number of U.S. troops was at 335,000. In March of 1971, President Nixon's approval rating had dropped to 50%, while the approval rating of his Vietnamization strategy had dropped down to 34%. Half of all of the Americans polled believed that the war in Vietnam was morally wrong. This led President Nixon to remove even more troops, and by the end of the year, there were only 157,000 U.S. military personnel in South Vietnam. At the end of 1972, there was only 27,000 troops still in South Vietnam. On January 27, 1973, all parties agreed to a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all remaining United States troops within 60 days, the release of all prisoners of war, and the creation of an international force to keep the peace. President Nixon stated, "As a consequence of the success of the military aspects of Vietnamization, the South Vietnamese people today, in my view, are fully capable of providing for their own in-country security against the North Vietnamese." And on March 29, 1973, the last remaining American troops were pulled from South Vietnam, and President Nixon declares, "The day we have all worked and prayed for has finally come." However, just a couple years later, on April 30, 1975, North Vietnam forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, thus causing the South Vietnamese forces to surrender that same day. Between 1 million and 2.5 million South Vietnamese citizens were put into large re-education camps. The purpose of these re-education camps was to learn to obey and understand the ways of the new government. The prisoners were put to physical work such as cutting trees, planting corn and root crops, clearing the jungle, digging wells and garbage pits, constructing barracks within the camp and fences around it, and then there were also more dangerous jobs such as clearing minefields where no safety equipment was provided. As a result, many prisoners were often killed or wounded from minefield explosions. The work was done in the hot tropical sun, by prisoners who were poorly nourished and received little or no medical care. The poor health, combined with hard work, made life very difficult for these prisoners. Some prisoners were incarcerated for up to 17 years, while thousands of men and women were tortured due to disobeying the rules. Deaths from starvation and disease occurred frequently, and bodies were often buried in graves on site, which were later abandoned. It is believed that around 165,000 prisoners died while in these re-education camps.